And so in the context of these inquiries, sex workers are always framed as inherently deceptive, despite the inquiries existing for the sole purpose of investigating police corruption towards these populations. So Judge Tigchelaar said in his report that he always considers an element of lying when brothel keepers and prostitutes are testifying unless there is corroboration from a more reliable source. And you can guess what that reliable source would be. So the police, right? Hi, thank you for staying. I think this is the very last panel. Amazing, we're gonna make it fucking wicked for you. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak at this festival again, very especially with Wawa and Sinéad, with whom I got to work this summer on a project funded by l'Observatoire des Privilèges and supported by Stella Dami-de-Memi. And this summer we did 6 weeks of knowledge sharing around sex work in our municipal and national archives. So I'm Alex Tigchelaar. I'm a sex worker rights advocate and a sex work historian. I'm also now doing a PhD, and I'm a university instructor after all that. Wawa?
Yeah, hi, so I'm Wawa. I am a multidisciplinary artist, and I'm also a community advocate activist, specifically working on housing rights in Chinatown with the lens of racial justice. I also participate with advocacy with the Chinese Canadian community on democratic rights, and yeah, work in the neighborhood at the community center. So I'm very located within the neighborhood in which we are having this panel. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sinead. I'm also a historian. I study histories of grassroots organizing and direct action tactics in Canada, and specifically looking at the ways that secrecy and keeping secrets in the telling of history is important.
Thanks, you too. So I work alone a lot, and to have companionship in these moments of intense discovery around violence in our communities is really empowering. And I think it's a really important metaphor for our conversation today, which I would qualify very broadly as stronger together. So locating sex work in the public record means bearing witness to relentless state, civic, and police violence. So mugshots, hostile brothel raid photos and reportage, exploitative media about our murders, our displacement, our arrests, our sexual health status, testimony from sex workers about police violence that are completely undermined or ignored. It's very painful and enraging to encounter these documents. Sometimes they involve our friends and work colleagues, and sometimes we were even there when this violence took place. So part of the work that I do currently involves speaking with other women who have done sex work in Montreal from around the late 1960s to the early 2000s. I'm particularly interested in what we remember about our work sites, since despite our immense contributions to the city's economic growth and international social profile, they are so often demolished without fanfare, or even worse, with enthusiasm, as evidenced by the Quartiers des Spectacles, which eagerly kicked out all the hookers to make a visual theme park which pays homage in part to the long-standing presence of sex work in this area. So this red lighting design that they installed to welcome tourists and influencers. It runs completely contrary, actually, to the lived experiences of women who worked here for a few centuries, who report being stalked and harassed by the police constantly. But you don't have to take my word for it. You may simply visit les archives de la ville de Montréal and go through the dozens of boxes of the thousands and thousands of arrest warrants issued to women for planage and for vagabondage were being found in houses of ill repute, which, by the way, were also called rooming houses, and many of them were down on Viger, which was then known as Vitré. And these are the only ones. They're actually only to the middle of the 20th century, this particular archive. They don't have publicly available warrants and so on from the 1950s onward. Their later holdings documenting police violence are in the form of media. So when I speak to other senior sex workers about our experiences for our podcast, my questions don't typically involve law enforcement, but you can't actually speak to women about their spatial experiences as sex workers without law enforcement being mentioned, right? So this is where I was assaulted by this cop, that's where the cops used to rob us, this is where the cops used to track and chase us, that's where they would yell our names, our dead names on the PA system attached to their cruisers. And even me, when I recall one of my workspaces in the 1990s, I think about the kitchen that used to be in there because it was a restaurant and so on until around the 70s or 80s. But when I was working, it was used exclusively by the police to check our IDs and harass and intimidate us. So our spatial histories as sex workers are right to the city. These are directly connected to these asymmetrical and violent relationships with law enforcement.
So it's important when we're speaking of spatial experience that we are in this specific location as we discuss the negative encounters that communities have with law enforcement. 138 years ago to the month just half block down, which way is it?
It would be south, yeah?
Yeah. I can't see very well. Kate Mackenzie's brothel was raided and everyone in it was arrested and fined. We know that for decades around that early part of the 20th century and possibly in this very location, which we are now, Asian businessmen were subjected to raids and fines for selling lottery tickets or running Paggy houses, being accused of running alleged opium dens. And we know this because of the many documented raids that we have located on brothels and betting houses and alleged opium dens on Charles Borromée, and then now called Clark, whose street's name changed, traced from digital newspaper article and actual material archives.
So now that we're situated in how this is relevant to where we're sitting right now, I'll introduce sort of the project and the framework of the panel that we're going to present. So we decided to sort of base this panel very similarly on the way that this project ran, which was Wawa and I as research assistants to Alex, who was acting as our mentor in sort of the archival methodologies that she's developed as like raccoon sex work methodology, the no-storage methodology. And so we worked together for these 6 months. So we want these 6 weeks. So we want this sort of panel to reflect the sort of dynamic between us as Wawa and I asking questions of Alex and then her asking us to reflect on it back and forth. And throughout we'll be showing some archival images and some of the pages of the zine that we produced throughout. In this process, we inevitably exchanged and questioned ideas around representation, knowledge production, audience, harm reduction, and bearing witness to institutional violence, always in dialogue with feminist and decolonial perspectives, and situating where we are, especially in the red light district, in Chinatown, in the Settler Colony. So some of these internal conversations are the ones we want to share with you today on this panel, mostly because they resonate with other radical struggles, and because they underscore the thesis of this festival and what we're presenting here, that sex workers have historically endured police violence and brutality, and they have been ACAB for more than 300 years in Montreal. So with that being said, let's get started. So in the span of our research, we covered hundreds of years of history of sex work in Montreal. And these span from court logs in the 1860s to tabloid rags of the 1960s, and so much more in between. So Alex, if you could speak to some of the major thorough lines that we found in these archival documents that specifically speak to the relationship between sex workers and police.
Okay, there's a few of them, but we've narrowed down just, I guess, 2 for today. And one of them is just extortion, right? So in our period of research, which again, 1860s to 1990s, we might know judicial inquiries about police extortion and corruption that result in absolutely no action against the cops. This was very, very common. So to name just 3, there was the Taschereau hearings in the early 1900s, the Coderre hearings in 1923 and 1924, and the Caron hearings in the 1950s. And so in the context of these inquiries, sex workers are always framed as inherently deceptive, despite the inquiries existing for the sole purpose of investigating police corruption towards these populations. So Judge Taschereau said in his report that he always considers an element of lying when brothel keepers and prostitutes are testifying unless there is corroboration from a more reliable source. And you can guess what that reliable source would be. So the police, right? And Taschereau said about one of the officers under investigation, Captain Bellefleur, and this is again in the early 1900s, he said, "La réputation et l'avenir de cet officier ne peuvent être à la merci de 2 femmes prostituées et d'une troisième qui sort à peine d'un caractère où le mensonge est la règle et où la perjure ne coûte pas. J'acquitte donc le capitaine Bellefleur comme je l'ai fait déjà dans mon rapport préliminaire." So I have also uncovered a lot of evidence prior to this, a letter from 1869 from a brothel keeper named Thomas Choquette in this area, detailing this particular officer, Vincent Lafon's threats to murder him, Lafon's rape of a 14-year-old girl, his extortion of girls working on the street outside of Choquette's brothel, and nothing was done about this. Lafon went on to have a long and very comfortable career, and we see his name often in judicial records. So we may go forward also a century, right, to a news story from 1981 when the so-called morality squad was disbanded for approximately a year. So the story drives this very common occurrence home with shocking complacency. So an argument was made that by dissolving the force, chances of corruption by the police would escalate because it eliminated the mutual surveillance between units, which, quote, diminished temptations of corruption. So of course, the police are completely aware of this issue, right? And the idea that internally they would provide any appropriate means of preventing corruption is completely absurd. We know this is absurd because of the many corruption cases where it's clear the police cannot stop others in their ranks from 1, extorting sex workers, and 2, I'll just say ineffective extortion at that. So why is a woman paying you like $10 a week, which I don't know is like 2 or 3 grand in today's, probably even more, when you cannot keep your confrères from raiding her brothel, right? You can't, these fucking buffoons can't even do extortion properly. Like 0 out of 10 Yelp review on their extortion. So another through line, of course, as we all know, is the police are not just the police, but rather a cluster of institutions that work together, right? So in this particular case, nuns, priests, doctors, nurses, social workers, and social work, by the way, was a profession that started at McGill University in around 1919, and of course it attracted women very specifically, right? So nuns ran the women's prisons and reformatories. The priests testified in corruption cases against prostitutes, and they provided glowing testimony for the police officers. Social workers were really just a feminized version of law enforcement. I think people are aware of this. And the police have the power to interpolate people into their surveillance cases, and we see this to this day, right? So those are 2 through lines.
Yeah, and bouncing back on what Alex is saying, like one of the things that came to mind when I'm looking at the context of Chinatown and racial justice is how you mentioned like the moral entrepreneurs, and like throughout our research we found how while looking at the Asian sex workers in the records and trying to look for people from the community or people that were located in Chinatown, well, first of all we couldn't find them, but what we found was the men, like the Asian men, businessmen that were owning like shops in Chinatown, and they were all criminalized for like open dens and gambling, selling lottery tickets and whatever. So there's like this connection between when we're looking at the presence of Asian bodies within the criminal records in the red light district. It is non-dissociated from the manufactured criminalization of these Asian men with gambling and lottery. And I don't know, I'm thinking about how like right now in Chinatown, like Chinese Canadians are being manufactured again under this China thread because of like, I don't know, geopolitical like tensions are happening and like that are always affecting the bodies on the line, like living their mundane life. Last year we had a raid from the RCMP in our neighborhood. They came in and they started doing their foreign interference operations and going to the business owner shops and starting to manufacture this threat that there might be Chinese spies in Chinatown, which is kind of absurd when you think about it. I mean, if I was a Chinese spy, I would go to Chinatown, but whatever. I might be one. So I'm just saying, like, so I'm thinking about how these moral entrepreneurship, of course, like when you're looking at systemic patterns, like they just change forms and they take like different kind of labels. But at the end of the day, it's important through the archive to see how these patterns evolve and how they're still affecting the communities, and also how different like marginalized communities' struggles are subject to the same patterns that are tied to like making like this nation, colonization, and deciding when it suits which bodies are like matters and which bodies are disposable.
Maybe just to add to that quickly, I think that, yeah, what both of you are saying, something we talked about a lot is like the sort of like the moral entrepreneurship, but looking at it as the way that there's really like a business of morality, the same way that there's like a business around crime, and that these nuns and these other women that were looking for like places in society are able to like capitalize off of the sort of moral structures that were being used sort of as nation building tactics, as a way to legitimize, you know, Canada and the values and the morals that it's built by, but also to like financially actually benefit from it. In the same way that conversations that we just heard about housing are all shaped by the way that people can make money off of it, the courts, the prisons, all of these things are shaped around colonial capitalist tactics, but are often most digestible when they're shaped around sort of markers of morality, and that everyone has a role to play in upkeeping them, and you can actually make a living off of it, whereas others are criminalized for surviving.
Also want to add something off script when I'm thinking about the panel that Stella gave earlier, thinking about like how as allies, because most of the people here are probably all aligned like with that the police does not like provide safety for our communities and that there's alternative ways, and I'm thinking like within ourselves like how we can be in solidarity with those who are being harmed the most within the struggle, and thinking about the way that we also contribute, as you're saying, to these narratives. When we think about trafficking that was mentioned before, is like how are we like contributing to like this kind of formation of like bodies that needs to be saved, and like these bodies that needs to be these dangerous bodies, like. So I'm just circling back to how as like progressive people here, like we can also contribute to this like without knowing. So anyways, off script. But now kind of want to go to the talk about the criminalization found in the archive. Alex, you taught us in the research your homemade acronym, FTP Square, meaning fuck the police, fuck the press. So what does the archive tell us about the relationship between the police and the press in Montreal, and why is this relevant and necessary to include the press when we say ACAB? For sex workers, and extending to marginalized communities, both historically and today.
And we can also say fuck the prohibitionists too. But as far as fuck the police and fuck the press go, we could actually talk about dozens of examples, and I'm going to ask Wawa and Sinead also to reflect on this. Sinead, very particularly maybe those cartoons you found, the editorial cartoons from the 80s or 90s. And also, Wawa, you have some things to say about this. But I want to highlight two cases in particular. So the first is a news story from 1986, covered in La Presse. It's about undercover sting operations conducted by female officers posing as prostitutes in the red light. As reported by La Presse, Nicole, the cop, she finds it fun to play a prostitute. And she doesn't have to worry, right? The article says, because she knows there's an unmarked police car close by to protect her, and she also has a 38 concealed. So we could actually do a whole panel on this vile police tradition and the fact that a woman pretending to be a sex worker feels protected by the police while real sex workers are raped, robbed, and assaulted by the police. Also, just as an aside, acting like a sex worker is also what sex workers do too. Like, this is the very definition of work, right? Pretending to be something for money. But the question here, actually, is the connection between these operations and the media. And I would argue that these operations, which take place constantly, right? Like, they are always throwing female police officers out on the street dressed like hookers. They're largely ineffective, but the whole point of them is this well-publicized gotcha quality, right? It's the public nature, this like gangbang of surveillance, which is intended to generate fear and shame, and by extension, a very dangerous atmosphere in which women end up working. And so these operations are intended, they're created with the intention of staging them in the media. The police instrumentalize the media and vice versa. So that is one example. This complicity also is nothing new. The media in this city since at least the 1700s, but our research shows in the 1860s, especially in the Montreal Evening Star, as soon as that newspaper launched in January of 1869, there was a column called Days and Nights, which was written, and I'm just gonna out this motherfucker. His name is G.T. Lanigan, and he was also the police reporter. He would go on like police raids and write about the brothels and so on. And clearly these articles were designed as a form of like entertainment, right? Like, so people were picking up the newspapers just to read these things. So there's this long-standing tradition of this collusion between the police and the media. And our media colludes with the police to frame sex work for public consumption in a very, very specific way, and frame police in a very specific way, to the valorizing good guy shit versus the dregs, right? And this exists to this day too. And it's really actually something to see the names of officers in stings and arresting officers on warrants, while also knowing, as we do from our research, that they've been accused by brothel keepers of extreme violence, of pedophilia, of rape and extortion, and also issuing death threats. They never suffer any negative consequences for this, and again, you can trace them as having long and comfortable careers, Vincent Fanon, for example. So reporters don't just happen to be on location when there's a raid or operation enacted. They're called in to be witnesses to it, right? And very, very specific witnesses. The origins of the word report are to like bring back, like report, and that is precisely what they do. They're often just mouthpieces for the law enforcement's negative conceptualizations of sex work and promotion of the police force. So there's a lot of immaculate evidence over this, over centuries in our public archives, including very recently Operation Northern Spotlight. And this evidence actually exists in perfect condition, right? Because sex workers are so dehumanized that it's a very little consequence for reporters to publish photos of our violated corpses, our humiliation at being so-called caught at work, when really it's the framing, right? The conditions of which the media and the police manufacture. They create these conditions for people being shocked and ashamed to be caught at work. And our experiences when we confront our assailants and abusers, and by that I mean the police in court, and even our sexual health status. So this relationship between press and police, it seeks to take away our power to tell our truths.
FTP squared that I found maybe more surprising in the archives is that when actually like flipping through these newspapers, like if you weren't really flipping, you're like doing microfiche, so like spinning through these newspapers, especially à la police, like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, these are the sort of like tabloids that are showing these like violent, horrible images of corpses, of raids, of mugshots, but they also almost always have a centerfold of like the stripper of the month or like the stripper of the week, and also this like absolute like, I don't know, adoration of these women as well. And I think it felt really clear to be another example of this sort of dichotomy that always exists around this like criminalization or this like stereotyping of marginalized communities that just kind of points to how untrue they are, how much bullshit there is, that both can exist in the same way, that these women are both victims or villains, or that they are disgusting but also like so sexy, and I think that also just points to the way that these newspapers were being used to fulfill a certain purpose, and the purpose wasn't really a clear one or the other. It was just that, I don't know, a lot of the time they were making money off of these women, like sex sells, and selling sex is wrong, and they like can't really figure out which one to like fully go with. Yeah.
And kind of bouncing off of that, I'm thinking about how, well, at the end of the day, it's about how our body can be instrumentalized, like for a different narrative and like for different, I don't know, policies that needs to pass. And I'm thinking about when we are looking at racialized bodies, how we also experience and like we can share kind of experience with having labels put on us. Like when we think about the concept of Orientalism, like the way that Asian women or like Arab women bodies are kind of orientalized, either is like it being like bodies that needs to be saved from a specific threat or a specific dangerous man, and like that also needs to be criminalized, and like that's a trope that is very necessary for the functioning of the colonial project. And I'm also thinking about how throughout the archives we found so many of these names, different names in which like the Chinese community was used. At one point it was the Celestials, and, like, mind you, that sounds pretty sick, but at that time, being a Celestial had to do with being like an alien, was about being something that's like absolutely like
otherworldly,
and like, and so also kind of validates the idea that whatever they say, like, we don't really know if it's correct, and like,
well, yeah, like in the legal documents, some of the things that we found, Asian people were like, well, they can't actually tell the truth because they're not testifying on a Bible, like they don't, so there's this conceptualization that both sex workers and Asian people cannot tell the truth in the colonial construct of law enforcement.
Exactly, so when we're looking at these like manufactured like archetypes, also from what you were saying, now I'm also thinking about a very like interesting contradiction that we see right now in Chinatown, like we're talking about fuck the police, fuck the press. I feel like things haven't changed, and like it's just bodies and like same labels but different placeholders, and now we have like a very interesting contradiction where Asian and like communities from marginalized communities, like racialized communities, are calling for more police, and they are being platformed right now to have more media attention, to call for more police, because now they can serve this whole colonial project to ask for more police. And like, if you continue to follow our work, like we're about to out these car people and to talk about how like they're instrumentalizing like racialized bodies to call for more police for their own political agenda, whatever. That's not into that. But so yeah, this very interesting contradiction to show how it's important to looking at the archive and to look at the experience of our marginalized like community members is like how it's all about class and it's not about racial identity politics of any sort. I know she not spit on that concept, which is how it evolved now today. So we have like these new bodies that are calling for more police, and they are superstars in the press. Like right now, what do you hear? You hear like, calling for more police in Chinatown because of for urban safety, and like the new bodies that are being criminalized are unhoused populations, and so placeholders has just changed. So yeah, that's it. Manufactured, model minority, and that also pits racialized body against each other. That also was a colonial kind of like strategy. You have like historically, like I remember, like when we're looking at the way that Chinese men after the construction of the railroad, where we could not, like, when there was no jobs anymore, and like Canada fell into a whole, like, a big socioeconomic crisis. We had to kick out the Chinese and validate, like, having like exclusion laws to kind of kick out Chinese and like not allowing us to come to Canada. So Chinese men were considered as like pedophiles, like stealing like white wives from white men and whatever. And now, like, eventually in history they became these asexual, like, obedient men, and like it's just always changing. These labels are changing, and they're like pit against other marginalized communities that are considered as dangerous, like criminals and like pimps and whatever. So anyways, like just seeing all this pattern through the archives. Oh yeah, and okay, yeah, cool. So now I kind of want to fall into knowledge production, bouncing off the FTP square, thinking about how these archival materials, the archive, their intended purpose, their content and their preservation are all created through enforced state violence, surveillance, and criminalization of sex workers. What does it mean to be a researcher while being a community member utilizing these archives, and what are some of these ethics and methodologies you have developed, Alex, in doing this archival research to mitigate the violence?
So as a community member, I will not publish mugshots in any of the work that I do. With very few exceptions, I don't engage with photos of raids and sting operations. These photos are taken with limited or no consent at all, so we need to recognize that, right? And a lot of archives and a lot of museums, they love these mugshots, they find them so scandalous. Those are photos of women taken without consent in the process of extreme, sometimes, police violence. So we need to respect that. They're shaming deterrence technologies, that's what they're designed for, right? You don't want to end up like this bitch, do you? And so they're intended also to legitimize police violence. And that's number one. Number two, I don't know if anyone in here has ever been arrested and forced to do a mugshot. You don't always look your best. So we don't do that to the girls. That is simple girl code. You do not publish photos of girls. It's just girl code. We don't do that. So that's the other reason. Historian Marianne Pretend, she calls these legal records, right? All of these things together. Documents generated by our misdemeanors. And I love this word, misdemeanor. It means like acting poorly. It's a transgression. And so for me as a community member researcher, I see them also as documents generated by our resistance, because transgression is resistance. And this is not even just me putting a happy spin on this situation. These records are genuinely evidence of women resisting imposed poverty and patriarchy sanctioned by the church and the state and the elite. Resisting assigned roles, right? They're resisting these assigned roles as women, resisting their place in society. So we see often, and Wawa, you actually have a slide about this. Yeah, there it is. We see women arrested over and over, but we see these women so inured to this system of oppression that there are legal templates available for them. These are from the 1930s. Just to sign authority over to their attorneys, right, to deal with it. They don't even have time to go to fucking court. They're running a business, so they do this, and we see this actually with Asian business people as well, that they're so inured to the system of surveillance and oppression that they just have these templates. We also see women arrested over and over and over and over again, suggesting they are not going anywhere, and that criminalization will not deter them from doing sex work. So one of my favorite historical hookers, Philomene Og, she would not leave this neighborhood on Saint-Timothée for decades and decades, right? You see her always in court, arguing for her right to the city, for her place in the neighborhood. We see women smiling in arrest photos, sometimes crossing their arms in contempt and giving side-eye. And so when I approach these archives, I do so with the intention of investigating and also honoring women's resistance to police violence and corruption, and providing a strong historical case for the defunding of the police. Sex workers have been ACAB in this city for over 3 centuries, and their history of this and their negative encounters with law provide rich data for the, both for decriminalization and for defunding. And we may also notice this when we speak with women who have worked more recently, and we cross-reference these stories with much older documents, we may see a common discourse emerging that spans other communities too, and Wawa gestured at this, and it's about health. This concept, this perception that we pollute neighborhoods, even this term house of ill fame, disorderly house, these are exonymic historic terms for brothels. They suggest infection and disease and dirtiness. When Drapeau was gearing up to level the red light district for his Place des Arts in the 1950s, media reported that the neighborhood was a zone lépreuse. These were the words used in the media. When Christian Iaccarini was laying the groundwork for the QDS 50 years after this, he said the neighborhood was in a catastrophic state. So we need to respond to this conceptualization of certain populations polluting neighborhoods, right? Because it's ongoing, it has historical precedence, it's a point of solidarity in criminalized and negatively racialized communities. This idea of being a dirty geography, right? Like your body being a polluting element in a neighborhood, a defiling influence. Does anyone have anything to say about that? Yeah, oh fuck yeah.
Yeah, I want to respond first to the sort of like the resistance that we located in archives, and just how much of it there was, and how overt so much of it was. And you mentioned Philomene Hogue, and there was a few times when early on he kind of encouraged us to like find our girl in the archive and like who we really related to or connected with or just excited by. And my girl was Fanny Bell, and we found that at least like 4 or 5 arrests between like 1880s and like 1902, and I feel like she stuck out because of just how audacious she was, and that sort of became this way that we were framing the sex workers' tactics of enacting ACAB was through their audacity, and that being like sort of a point to take away for like current organizing towards it.
Well, she was carrying a knife in her mouth, wasn't she?
Yeah,
it work. And we cannot blame these women for these violent encounters, right? Like some of them are accused of punching nuns. Well, no shit. These bitches had control of your life since you were fucking 8 years old, you know? So.
Yeah, they described her as like, creating pandemonium in court and insulting the police officers, hurting the judge's feelings, like encouraging all the other workers who were there with her to like sing songs like in resistance, and then bragging that she has a knife and she's gonna stab whoever tries to put her in the jail. And they did in fact find that she was hiding like a tiny blade under her tongue, and she was like fully intending to stab whichever carceral figure was attempting to like lock her in the jail cell. So she stuck out, and there's obviously a lot more sort of like covert ways that audacity was expressed as well, but the overt ones were like, I think the particularly feel-good moments.
We, by the way, have about 5 minutes of chatting before we get to questions. It's around 5:45. I just wanted to let everybody know.
Perfect. Okay, so like bouncing off thinking about audacity, I think like this is something I wanted to address. I was thinking a lot about the research because, you know, like model minority Asians are, you know, seen as like obedient and subservient, whatever, and like the way that a situated perspective really helps to like read the archives through the line, because it's one of the big work that we have to do is like reading through the line. What does it mean? You know, for example, before it's like very specific piece of paper. It's just like in the court saying that she's allowing her her lawyer to just testify for her at court because she don't give a fuck. She doesn't have time. She has a business to run, and like she's just doing it. And she's probably has encountered with the police many times, so she's just used to that thing. She signed a paper and she's carrying on with her life because it's about work and survival. So I was thinking about how we can find these Asian women and how like Asian sex workers are kind of breaking this allegation of model minority, because you're looking at the Club 888, which is a club that we found in the red light district near.
It's not in the red light, it was actually at Drummond.
Yeah,
Saint-Catherine. Yeah.
Perfect, I'm more
in the 90s.
Saint-Catherine, Peel Metro. Club 888 was a club where they would only hire Asian sex workers, and it was like really, you know, like, oh, like Asian only, like from Hong Kong, whatever. They were actually from Thailand. And one of the funny thing was like, okay, like you see the owner with his protégé. This is how like it was talked about in the media. But in reality, and like it will also say that these women will call him daddy and whatever. But there's also a strategy, and like this, like if you're looking at it from a situated perspective, there's agency in this. Like you understand the labels that Asian women are being put under, and so how can you co-opt them to continue making money and continue to survive? So you have like these Asian women that are like daddy, 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 which is like not a mono minority happening. This is a woman that's also enacting her own agency in her own way to continue doing the work that she wants to do. So like these protégés are playing the protégé very like with agency and like with full consciousness. So yeah, and you wanna
yeah, going off of sort of the theme of audacity and who we connected to, throughout this research process, you returned often how impactful and meaningful it was for you to physically touch the documentation that these workers past have also touched, as it was most often the only thing that remains of them, and the lives they live, the spaces they occupy. So can you talk a bit about the visceral impact this has on you personally, and also how you think this can be felt collectively or organized?
I think on all of us, right, to touch that documentation is really quite meaningful. So I guess, is everyone in here familiar with the sex worker rights organization, Stalalan de Memi? Are you familiar? So in the process of researching for this project, for my thesis on the 30th anniversary of the organization, I found Stella's unmarked grave in the Côte des Neiges cemetery. And I found a cache of articles about her as an audacious teen runaway in the 1910s, and so much more. It was an incredibly meaningful discovery, and here we all are honoring her grave. She's not on the gravestone. The rest of her family is, so it's even more than unmarked, right? She's excluded, and we know, we can imagine why. And so, for me, the most important discovery in this, though, was a bundle of her arrest warrants, and because these are items that she herself touched, right? Which makes them precious for that very reason to me, that she touched them. And so there's details on these arrest warrants. Arrest warrants are very, very important because you'll see things written on them. A couple of sex workers are referred to as spinsters, and I'm like, they were certainly not. They had boyfriends, how dare you? But details noted by the serving officer on the warrant led to this question, right? Because Stella, she had taken off, she was on the run, she dyed her hair brown. It was very, very clear that she was attempting to evade law enforcement and her family, right? That this idea was circulating that she was lost and all of this stuff, which was very convenient for the family, right? But details on the warrant, it led me to this particular question, which is, what does it matter where a person chooses to go? And to me, it really does as sex workers, because she chose, when she was brought back from the United States, not to go to her parents' house, but to an apartment not 2 blocks away from where I live on de Chateaubriand in Little Italy. And that's where she was served those warrants. And I did more research, and you know, a man lived there, and she clearly, he was either a client or a daddy or whatever. But it matters actually where we as sex workers choose to go, because so much of the way we're documented as occupying space is through systems of punishment, right? So prisons, jails, reformatories, courtrooms, the backs of police cars, and so on. So where we actually choose to go is really important, and that might seem like a small nugatory detail to many people, but not to me. Because we are documented in court records in places that we don't want to be, I think it's really important when we recognize, oh yeah, she didn't want to go back to her family home despite what her mother said, right? Her agency in this matter is really important, and that's one reason why these historical documents, you know, again, as dry as they can be, they're really important to putting our histories together, piecing our histories together in this city. And it was really, I came across her warrants when I was at the Archive de Montréal, and I was like, and the archivist, like I couldn't believe what I was seeing, right? I could not believe that she had touched 5 minutes. Okay, yeah, we gotta wrap up, but she had touched these, and that was very special to me, so.
Yeah, Maybe we'll end there.
Yeah, we should, right? Yeah, I think so. I think because if people have questions, we can answer for 5 minutes. Thank you. 10?